Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So, Barbara, thank you for joining me. I'm really pleased to have you in these really unusual times. Pretty uncertain for somebody who's works in the architecture department, no?
Well, I think that it's uncertain for everyone. But you're right. Architecture deals with bricks and mortar, and somehow the whole emphasis and shift to remote learning, remote environments, that is actually, I think, particularly challenging for those in architecture.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine. And so let us sort of dive into your work. First of all, how did you find yourself so sort of interested in architecture?
Again, it's a good question. Going back into the mists of time, I was studying art history. Mm-hmm. This was at undergraduate when I was at school at McGill University in Canada. And I loved art history, but I felt troubled by the fact that it didn't really impact people in their day-to-day lives. And I guess my attention became fixed on architecture because I was aware that it so shapes and influences the fabric of our lives and our everyday experiences, but often in quite a background way. We very often aren't aware of how much of our lives are shaped by our built environments. And it struck me that this was something that I really wanted to delve into and bring to the foreground.
Mm-hmm. And so you ultimately got into research in architecture.
I did. So in Montreal, where I was studying, there was this really amazing institution called the Canadian Centre for Architecture. It's one of the world's leading architectural libraries. And because of the proximity of McGill to the CCA, I was able to start to explore this subject in greater depth. And basically, I was hooked. And one of the leading programs in architectural history at the time was actually at UCL in London. Okay. And so I came here to pursue my master's. And then I carried on and did a PhD, and I basically never left. 25 years later, I'm still here.
And so it must have been must have gone through quite some journey within your research.
Yes, well, unbeknownst to me, I entered the field at a really interesting, really dynamic time. So this would have been the mid-1990s, and feminist theory was really starting to enter the field of architectural history in a serious way. So feminist theory, also queer theory, post-colonialism. And because architecture is a profession, it tends to be a bit more conservative, or it was in the 90s. A little bit slow, I would say, in picking up on critical theory. But in the mid-90s, this sort of inflection of critical theory into architecture was well underway. And so I was coming into it with this interest in everyday environments, the built fabric. And this was exactly the moment at which those kinds of questions were beginning to be quite seriously examined within the discipline. So I decided, I was very interested in women and the built environment. And so I decided that I would write my dissertation on public toilets for women.
Okay.
When did they first begin to appear in London's streets? How were they received? What kind of controversies surrounded them? And because I thought, well, you know, if I want to see the impact that gender has had on the built environment, what better place to look than a female public toilet? And it was, in fact, an incredibly rich and interesting study which came out of that.
And so what did you find at the time? What were sort of your conclusions?
So female public conveniences, probably not surprisingly, were not a regular feature of London streets until the end of the Victorian era, the beginning of the Edwardian era. They were hugely, hugely controversial. Nobody wanted them in anywhere near their homes or businesses. But of course, they were really essential because at the time, there were many female workers who were commuting to and from factories, to and from their places of work, often quite long commutes, and they had nowhere to go. And so it became a bit of a cause célèbre. George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, among others, ended up campaigning for female public toilets. I suspect he did it in part to irritate his more conservative council members. He was a member of the local government at the time. But nonetheless, this was one of these very kind of odd incidents in history where the campaigns for female public toilets brought together a really unusual coalition of reformers and those interested in women's rights to try to improve women's mobility within the city.
And so was there like a need for women's mobility in the city at the time, or was society still dominated by sort of men in the workplace and that sort of thing?
Again, really good question. The reality was that women were moving around the city, especially working class women, as I said, many of whom were commuting to and from jobs, paying jobs. But at the time, there was this prevailing ideology of the separate spheres, which maintained that women's place was the home. And so, by definition, somehow, a woman moving freely through the city was an anomaly, potentially a threat. Mobile women were regarded with considerable suspicion. They were seen as potentially immoral. They were sometimes even called public women, that is, prostitutes, because of this freedom they were enjoying to move around the city. And public toilets became suspect because they enabled that free movement.
Well, that's very interesting. So would you say that there's a sort of an inflection point from public toilets becoming widely present in society or in the cities? Was there an inflection point as to sort of how architecture changed to accommodate the woman?
During the Victorian era, it was very common for architecture to be highly segregated. And I should say it was not only segregated by gender, but it was segregated by class as well. So you would have tradesmen's entrances, and then you would have the official public entrance to a building, for instance.
All right.
And over the course of the 20th century, that kind of rigid segregation began to break down. Buildings, at least outwardly, under the influence of the modernist movement, became more egalitarian in appearance. So a really classic building I would cite in this regard is Royal Festival Hall, for instance, which was designed as part of the 1951 Festival of Britain. And that was very much designed as a building for all the public. It was designed along the idea of something called the social condenser. So it was meant to be a place that would bring together different elements of society and encourage mixing, which of course Victorian buildings absolutely did not do. They were designed on the opposite principle, that you would rigidly segregate different elements of the population. So I do think, at least outwardly, that kind of rigid segregation eased. But that is not to say, of course, that the built environment is an egalitarian place. I would say mechanisms of exclusion have simply become more subtle in many ways. But the built environment is still very much a manifestation of power relations, and it does still attempt to impose a certain kind of social order in society.
That's very interesting. So you mentioned that the elements of seclusion in the built environment are subtle now, as opposed to being overt. Can you give an example of that?
So one example I would give, although I must admit it's a building I love, but nonetheless, the British Library on Euston Road. I believe it was opened in the 90s, But it had a long gestation. It was designed by the architect, Colin St. John Wilson. And on the one hand, it's meant to be a democratic and welcoming building. It has a public piazza in front of it. You go through the doors, and it's a really remarkable building with indoor streets, an indoor piazza. So again, it's got this idea of welcoming the public. And it's meant to be a democratic space. However, the reality is that it's surrounded by high walls and gates, and it's quite intimidating for those people who somehow understand that they're not meant to enter. And it is, in fact, a policed space. So homeless people often gather right outside the gates, but don't actually enter into the precincts of the library because they know that they will be asked to leave. So there's all sorts of invisible, I would say, cues in many public buildings that make it clear to those, for instance, the homeless, that they're not welcome. It's not a truly public space, however much it has that appearance.
That makes a lot of sense, and sort of it's something that I would have never considered personally. You know, having not considered things from an architectural standpoint. But that sort of leads me on to think, or to ask you, how has architecture evolved in the 21st century? How are there key sort of themes that have emerged in architecture in the 21st century in the UK, for instance?
Architecture is such a diverse profession. It's hard to characterize. You've got commercial buildings, for instance, which I would say where the client perhaps is a speculative developer, and the building will end up being leased to various corporate clients. And that type of architecture, it's a fact of life. London is a commercial city. That type of architecture, I would say, is more aesthetically focused, perhaps. In terms of maybe smaller scale, less profit-oriented architecture, which is quite different, I would say there's much more interest now in community participation, architects working with neighborhoods to solicit their feedback and try to create more responsive environments. So a good example is a colleague of mine, someone called Jan Katine, and he has worked with dozens of UK high streets to try to enhance them, to revitalize them, but rather than imposing some kind of top-down process, he works with shopkeepers and the local council, and really tries to create environments that enhance the sort of existing mix of shop owners that really try to serve the local community. So there's a whole gamut of practices within architecture, and it's hard to characterize, but certainly the architecture that I'm most interested in is the architecture that tries to work very reflectively in an ethical way with the communities into which they're intervening.
Mm-hmm. And is that sort of is that gaining traction at the moment, where this sort of localized, I suppose, socially friendly architecture, is that getting traction, or is it still having to compete with all these forces of commercialization?
It's been around since the 60s.
Oh, so it's been around for a while.
Yeah. And look, commercial forces are not going away. We live in neoliberal times, but I would say that there is a very committed group of architects who are examining the ways in which architects work and can work, and are trying to act ethically. And that, to me, is an incredibly inspiring way forward. What perhaps has changed somewhat is that they're much more in step with the mood of the times. We're currently in this rather incredible time of social upheaval, and particularly with BLM. There are some very serious discussions opening up within architecture schools about racism. Architecture typically has been a very white middle-class profession, and people are making the point very forcefully now that we architects will never be able to serve a broad spectrum of the population so long as architects themselves are such a narrow social class. And so there are, I would say that discussions around diversity are accelerating and intensifying, and hopefully, there will be serious efforts on the part of the profession to tackle the lack of diversity in a more sustained way.
Which is something, I guess, something that is naturally going to happen given, like you mentioned, the social upheaval. But I guess something that's really interesting to me, firstly, with regards to social inclusion, is you might have people say, actually, well, some of the most famous architects in the world are not white. They're, like, for instance, Zaha Hadid was, an Iraqi female. So architecture could be seen as that, but what you're saying is it's still generally that's just the outliers.
Zaha was an incredible force, and she was, I believe, the first female to win the Pritzker Prize. She was, however, for a long time, one of the very few so-called starchitects who was in the profession. There were a few others, a very well-known female architect called Itsuko Hasegawa, The dean of my own school was Christine Hawley throughout the 90s, who practiced with Sir Peter Cook, one of the founding members of Archigram. So there were some prominent women in the field. But the fact remained that until very recently, only about 13% of registered architects were women.
Mm-hmm.
Because there has been a concern about the underrepresentation of women in architecture since the mid-90s, I would say that we have definitely seen some movement there. But we have a long way to go in terms of BAME and ethnic minorities.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we're really falling down.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose it's not too dissimilar to many other fields. What I'm interested in sort of kind of exploring is, how do you think this pandemic is going to shape architecture for the foreseeable future, given the fact that there's loads of unnatural things or previously unnatural things happening? For example, the social distancing and, people's reluctance to cough in public or, sneeze and that sort of stuff. How much does that impact architecture, do you think?
That's a great question. I hadn't thought about it quite in those terms. I hadn't previously thought about coughing, for instance. And architecture, as you know, in the 20th century, has always been very concerned with hygiene.
Mm-hmm.
And health. And actually, this was really one of the preoccupations of modernist architects, people like Le Corbusier and so on, the white aesthetic that they adopted for their buildings.
Mm-hmm.
It was mainly symbolic, of course, but it was meant to symbolize the eradication of dirt,
Mm-hmm.
disease. So the modernists really appropriated this whole hygienic discourse in their buildings. Whether or not that will happen now or how it will happen is really interesting to think about. Again, some of my colleagues are doing work on probiotic buildings. So they are actually looking at how you could implant surfaces with probiotics.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so those so-called good bacteria, so that you can, improve public health through buildings in that way. There's lots of really interesting research going on between architects and biologists or chemists, considering microbes and looking really at our environments through the lens of health. So I could see that being the kind of direction that opens up even more post-COVID. Otherwise, in terms of public buildings, for instance, I could see it just changing the configuration of buildings to make a greater emphasis, for instance, on entranceways, creating spaces for queuing. If that is going to be a feature, again, of our should I call it our COVID futures? There's no question that it will start to change the way that buildings are planned and laid out.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, these are some fascinating insights that, I didn't even know were possible with the probiotics, for instance. That's, mind-blowing stuff. I'm conscious of time because I know you've got a bit to do, but I want to ask you about your work on honeymoons. Yes. That seems really interesting, and I want to hear more about it.
So, I grew up near Niagara Falls, which is considered, or was when I was growing up, the honeymoon capital of the world. And you know how it is when you grow up with something, even one of the great wonders of the world, at your doorstep, you sort of come to think of it as a bit boring, or you take it for granted. But then when I moved to Europe, and when I started to study architecture, Niagara Falls is a honeymoon destination. It just came to seem odder and odder to me. Mm-hmm. And moreover, I was very aware that there was no equivalent place in Europe. There was no place that everybody went to on their honeymoon, except maybe Italy or the Amalfi Coast or something like that. But it just wasn't the same. So I got very interested in how does a place become so ritualistically connected with a moment, a great sort of moment in people's lives. And how then does a tourist industry get built up around it, including honeymoon hotels, honeymoon suites. Again, in what ways does architecture kind of enshrine these practices? And it did really interest me because architecture, I think, is great at scripting environments. And it somehow, in its walls or in its features, it embeds certain narratives, and it gives us cues as to how to behave. Mm. That does not mean that people always follow those cues. And in fact, I'm most interested in those moments where people miss the cues or ignore the cues or just choose to not follow them. Mm-hmm. I do believe that people have agency in the built environment. So I don't think architecture determines the ways that we behave, but it suggests ways that we should behave. And I always just thought it was very poignant that on a honeymoon, when you're with your partner, perhaps for the first time, you turn to these architectural environments that sort of help you understand how you should be feeling, how you should be behaving at this moment in time. It's like the architecture becomes a prop.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I mean, it sort of raises up a couple of points with regards to how we, or let me not say we, but how couples, when they're on their honeymoon, sort of interact with the environment. And so you have, for instance, right now you have in recent times, the Maldives has become this hotspot for honeymoons and this sort of manufactured island, and you have the equivalents in Dubai. So how much of that is also playing onto these human emotions, these innate feelings of like needing seclusion or something like that?
I those are very good examples. I think people at these moments, these really key milestones in one's life. So, getting married, you really want to enter an environment, if you can, that will protect you from uncertainty. You know what kind of experience you want. Mm-hmm. So you go to a place where you are going to, that's going to conform to your expectations or society's expectations of what you will experience post-wedding. It's like, I see it almost as if you're trying to ward off risk, the risk of failure, because to fail on your honeymoon has such powerful emotional consequences. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to deal with that. So you try to head it off by entering a manufactured environment that is going to deliver what you feel should be delivered.
Wow, that's really powerful. So it's like you're almost trying to guarantee your returns on your investment.
Absolutely. Except it's not just financial, it's emotional.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's so much pressure being placed on that moment. And in the 1950s, all of these advice writers would say things to newlyweds like, a mistake now is a mistake of a lifetime. So, with that kind of pressure being placed on you, you absolutely do not want anything to go wrong.
Wow, that's really fascinating. That's amazing. So where, if people are more interested in your work, where can people sort of find you online and interact with your work?
I'm not terribly good on social media, but I am a regular contributor to a really wonderful online journal. Mm-hmm. It's called Places Journal. Okay. I think it's a really remarkable publication because it's devoted to public scholarship on architecture. It's supported by architecture schools around the world, including my own school, the Bartlett. And it produces really thoughtful, really provocative pieces on urbanism, the landscape, architecture. It produces great photographic essays, some creative writing. So I try to publish there as much as possible because I really believe that scholarship should be open access, and too much of what we produce nowadays is hidden behind paywalls. Again, I think given where we are right now in the world, that I strongly suspect that will change dramatically in the next few years. But it's a magazine that I'm very proud to be associated with.
If you send me a couple of the your pieces on there, I'll link them onto the show so that people can get access to them instantly.
Great, I will.
What kind of advice would you give to anyone sort of getting into architecture or architectural research?
I would say I always feel funny about giving advice because I still feel so much like I'm sorting things out myself. But I would definitely say, think about the user. That would be my main advice. Too often in architecture school, you're told to think about form, or you're told to think about materials or aesthetics. And I think my main criticism of both the profession and education is that the user is considered too late in the process and as a kind of afterthought, whereas I believe the user should completely drive everything that architects do. You can still make really interesting architecture, but just put the user at the heart of your designs.
I think that is fundamental. I mean, that's advice that I've heard a few times from like software developers and all sorts of people that actually trying to appeal to the individual as opposed to their ego, which tends to be the case.
Yeah, I really agree. And, look, architecture, the special challenge is that architecture tends to be around for a while. So architecture uses change all the time. So a building may start off as a church and it may end up as a flat or a domestic residence, who knows? But nonetheless, I do think that user-centered buildings stand the test of time, even oddly, if that use changes, because they will have been somehow humanely designed.
Well, Barbara, I've really enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to have you here soon again.
Yeah, thank you, Hussein. I enjoyed it.
Cheers. Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.